The sky over the Solomon Islands shimmered with tropical heat. It was 1943, and 4 Japanese pilots stationed on the outer rim of the Pacific War. The air war had become routine. Each day brought another patrol, another chance to chase American dive bombers or intercept sluggish torpedo planes before they could reach the fleet. For the men flying the Mitsubishi A6M0, confidence remained high. They had the advantage in agility. They could outturn nearly anything. And so far, they had been fast enough to catch every threat sent their way. But then something new appeared in the sky. At first, it looked like a mistake. A blue-gray blur in the distance, flying alone, low and fast, skimming just above the waves. As it climbed, Japanese spotters caught a glimpse of something odd. The wings were bent, inverted. The shape was unfamiliar. It did not climb like a bomber. It rose like a predator. The Zeros turned to meet it, diving from higher altitude to cut off its path. Normally, this would be the moment the American plane broke formation or scattered. But this time, the stranger did not run. Instead, it accelerated. What followed lasted no more than 60 seconds. The Zeros tried to bank into it, but the enemy aircraft tightened its turn and pulled away with ease. One Zero pilot opened fire, but the rounds missed cleanly. Then came the roar of 6 .50 caliber machine guns as the bent-wing plane returned fire. One Zero exploded mid-turn. Another spiraled out of the sky, trailing smoke. By the time the rest of the Japanese formation regrouped, the American plane was gone, already vanishing into the clouds to the east. Back at base, the survivors gave their first reports. The new American fighter was fast, too fast. It climbed like a rocket and dove like a hawk, and its armament was devastating. It was not until weeks later that the name became known to them. F4U Corsair. Some began calling it the bent-wing monster. Others, with growing respect, simply called it deadly. The encounter over the Solomons was not isolated. Across the Pacific, more Japanese pilots would soon report the same thing. This was not the Wildcat they had grown used to fighting. It was faster, tougher, and more heavily armed. And it had no intention of playing by the old rules. What began that day was more than just a dogfight. It was a turning point. A moment when Japanese pilots looked up and realized that the sky they once ruled was beginning to shift beneath them. The Corsair had arrived, and it would not be ignored. Long before it flew into battle, the Corsair began as a drawing on a clean sheet of paper. In 1938, the U.S. Navy asked aircraft companies to build a new kind of fighter. It needed to be very fast, very strong, and able to land on aircraft carriers at sea. The engineers at a company called Vought had an idea. They wanted to build the fastest fighter the world had ever seen. So they chose a huge engine called the Double Wasp. It gave the plane more power than anything else in the sky. But that power came with a problem. The engine needed a very big propeller to push all that air, and a big propeller needed long landing gear to keep it from hitting the ground. Long landing gear can be weak, especially on a carrier. The engineers had to find a new solution. That's when they came up with the bent wings. They bent the wings downward near the body, then back up near the tips. This special shape allowed them to use shorter landing gear without hitting the propeller. It also helped the plane move through the air faster. It looked strange, but it worked. In May 1940, the first Corsair flew. It was fast, very fast. It flew over 400 miles per hour, which made it the fastest fighter in the U.S. military at the time. It could climb high very quickly and had a strong body, but it wasn't easy to fly. The engine pulled hard to one side on takeoff. The nose was so long that pilots couldn't see in front of them when landing. The tail would bounce. The landing gear was close together, which made the plane easy to tip or slide. When the Navy tested it on carriers, many pilots crashed. Some slid off the deck into the sea. Young pilots were scared of it. That's how it got one of its nicknames, the Ensign Eliminator. The Navy decided it was too risky for carriers, at least for now. But the U.S. Marines saw something different. They saw a plane that could fight better than any they had. So the Marines began flying Corsairs from land bases. It had 6 big machine guns. It could carry bombs or rockets. It could shoot down enemy fighters or attack ships and tanks. Once pilots learned how to handle it, the Corsair became one of the deadliest planes in the Pacific. Those strange bent wings became a warning. If you saw them coming, trouble was close behind. It may have looked ugly. It may have been hard to land. But in the air, it was a beast. And soon, Japanese pilots would learn what it could do. The Corsair looked like a monster. Big, loud, and powerful. It had a huge engine in the front, and its wings bent like a bird in mid-flap. Pilots were both excited and nervous to fly it. The Marines were the first to take it into battle. Their airfields were not on fancy bases. Most were rough strips of dirt carved out of jungle or coral. That made landings even harder, and the Corsair was not easy to land. The front of the plane was long. So long that when pilots came down to land, they couldn't see the runway. They had to guess where the ground was. Some came in too high, others came in too fast. The wheels were close together, and if the plane bounced, it could tip over. That happened a lot. But if you could get it off the ground, it came alive. The Corsair climbed faster than almost anything. It flew higher than the enemy's planes. And it had 6 machine guns that could tear through a fighter or even a small ship. Marines started training hard. Over and over, they practiced taking off and landing. They learned how to use short bursts of power to keep control. Some pilots gave the plane nicknames: the hose nose, because of its long front, or whistling death, because the air rushing through its wing vents made a ghostly sound. At first, many young pilots crashed their Corsairs before they even saw a battle, but those who learned how to fly it had a powerful weapon. In 1943, the first real fights began. Corsairs met Japanese Zeros over the Solomon Islands. The Zeros were still dangerous. They could turn quickly. They were light and could stay in the air longer. But the Corsair had something new: speed. When the Corsair dove, it dropped like a hammer. It was faster than any Zero. It could also take more damage. Zeros had no armor. One bullet could destroy them. The Corsair could take a few hits and still fly home. Pilots began changing how they fought. They stopped turning in circles with Zeros. Instead, they climbed above them, dove fast, fired quick, and climbed again. This tactic became known as boom and zoom. The Japanese pilots were not ready for it. Some didn't even know what kind of plane they were facing. They had never seen anything shaped like that before. One by one, Corsairs started winning fights. Not all, but more and more. Back at base, the Marines counted bullet holes in the wings and patched them up with tape and metal sheets. Then, the pilots flew out again. They were still learning, still testing, still crashing sometimes. But the Corsair was proving itself. It was no longer just a monster on the ground. It was starting to become a legend in the sky. At first, the Japanese pilots didn't take the Corsair seriously. From a distance, it looked strange. The wings were bent, the nose was long. Some said it looked like a flying accident. In the beginning, they called it names. They joked about how clumsy it looked. They believed their Zeros could fly circles around it. And for a little while, they were right. In close dogfights, the Zero could still outturn the Corsair. It was lighter, more nimble, and had years of combat experience. But then, something changed. Japanese squadrons began to lose more planes. Not just one or two, but entire patrols. Their best pilots were not coming back. Reports came in of American fighters diving from the sun, striking fast, then climbing away before the Zeros could react. It was the Corsair, and it was no longer funny. Japanese pilots started calling it whistling death. The name came from the sound the plane made as it flew. The wind howled through its wing vents, making a sharp, eerie whistle. By the time you heard it, it was already too late. The Corsair did not fight fair. It did not circle or dance in the sky. It fought with speed and power, climbed high, attacked fast, and disappeared. The Japanese pilots had no answer. One pilot wrote in his diary, "We believed we ruled the air. But this new American plane is different. It does not fear us." Some units were warned not to fight Corsairs unless they had a clear advantage. The Zeros could still win if they caught a Corsair at low speed or surprised it in a turn, but that was rare. The Corsair was faster in level flight. It dove quicker, it had more firepower, and it could take more punishment. In the past, one or two hits would destroy an American fighter, but Corsairs often returned with holes in their wings, their tail damaged, their engines coughing smoke, and still they came back. Morale began to shift. In briefings, Japanese commanders told their pilots to change tactics. Do not engage head-on. Avoid diving contests. Do not chase the Corsair in a climb. It was like trying to fight a wild animal that didn't follow the old rules. The pilots who had once laughed at it now scanned the skies in fear of it. They began to respect its silence, its speed, its sting. The Corsair was no longer just a fighter. It was a signal, sign that the skies were changing, that the Americans had brought something new. Not just a better plane, but a better way to fight. And for the Japanese, every encounter with the Corsair became a warning. The war in the air was no longer theirs to win. The Corsair had taken the fight from them. the Corsairs began to prowl the skies like hawks. No longer tied to defense, they now flew deep into enemy territory. The Pacific was their hunting ground, and the Japanese airfields were their prey. One of the first real tests came at Rabaul. The stronghold had once been a fortress of the Japanese Empire. It was surrounded by anti-aircraft guns and protected by layers of Zero fighters. American planes had feared flying near it, but now Corsairs were sent to challenge it head-on. On November 11, 1943, over 90 Corsairs swept in low, just above the treetops. They carried bombs and guns, flying in tight formations. The Japanese scrambled their fighters, but they were too late. Corsairs tore through the sky, dropping bombs on runways and storage depots. They fired on parked aircraft, trucks, and anything that moved. Dogfights broke out in every direction. In the old days, Zeros might have held their own, but this time, Corsairs outnumbered them, outgunned them, outflew them. Reports say more than 30 Japanese planes were shot down that day. Some Corsairs were lost too, but not many. Marine pilots radioed back excited voices. One said, "We hit them hard. Real hard. They couldn't keep up." Another described how a Zero dove at him, but the Corsair simply pulled up and left it behind like a toy. This was not just a lucky day. It became a pattern. As the weeks passed, the Corsairs flew deeper. They hunted enemy convoys. They strafed jungle airfields. They escorted bombers and shot down scouts. Wherever they appeared, Japanese pilots grew tense. Corsairs started to develop a fearsome reputation. Pilots painted shark teeth on the nose or added tally marks near the cockpit to count victories. Some squadrons had kill ratios as high as 11 to -1. That meant for every Corsair shot down, they had taken out 11 enemy planes. Even more than their kills, the Corsairs gave pilots confidence. These were no longer desperate missions. The men flying them felt like hunters, not targets, and that belief changed everything. On the Japanese side, frustration grew. Their supply lines were thin. Their veteran pilots were gone. New trainees barely had flight hours before they were thrown into battle. They faced an aircraft they could not catch, flown by men who no longer feared them. Corsairs became a shadow in the sky. It's not always seen, but always coming. They had changed the mood of the war. What once felt like a steady climb for Japan had started to slip backward. The Corsair was leading the way, carving that path through clouds and fire. For a long time, the U.S. Navy had kept the Corsair away from aircraft carriers. They thought it was too tricky to land. The nose was long. The landing gear was stiff. Pilots called it a wild horse on approach. Some crashed, some flipped, so the Navy played it safe. They kept the Corsair on land. But the war was changing fast. The island battles were moving across the Pacific, closer to Japan. The Marines needed carrier planes, and the Corsair had proven itself in battle. It was too good to ignore, so the Navy gave it a second chance. New training began. Pilots practiced landings over and over again. Engineers made small changes to the gear and the cockpit. They fixed the bounce, lowered the stall speed, and improved visibility. Slowly, the Navy started to trust the plane. In 1944, the Corsair finally joined carrier groups. It became the main fighter on floating airfields. And once it arrived, everything changed again. Now Corsairs could strike from anywhere. They flew off the decks, attacked enemy fleets, then returned before sundown. They had range, power, and speed. The Japanese Navy had never faced anything like it. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Corsairs helped create what pilots later called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese planes came in waves, but most never reached the carriers. Corsairs and Hellcats filled the skies. They shot down hundreds of enemy aircraft in a single day. From then on, the Corsair became the carrier's new champion. Japanese bombers could not get close. Zeros tried to intercept, but were outclassed. The skies that once belonged to Japan now belonged to something faster, stronger, and smarter. Corsair squadrons flew deep support for ground troops. They attacked bunkers, bridges, and tanks. Their 6 machine guns tore through jungle hideouts. They carried bombs under their wings and rockets on their sides. They became more than just fighters. They became flying weapons of victory. Pilots who had feared the Corsair's landing now begged to fly it. They trusted it, believed in it, called it the best plane they had ever flown. And on the other side, Japanese pilots stopped laughing. They scanned the skies carefully now. They knew the bent wings were not a joke. They were a warning. The Corsair had taken its place on the carrier deck, and with it came a wave of victories across the sea. The Pacific was narrowing, the enemy was retreating, and every time the Corsair's wheels lifted off a carrier deck, it brought the war one step closer to its final chapter. The more the Corsair showed up, the more the mood shifted in Japanese airfields. Zeros were still in the sky, but the confidence behind them had cracked. Something had changed. The laughter and cocky remarks about the bent-wing plane were gone. In their place was silence and a growing sense of dread. At first, the Japanese pilots had believed they could outturn the Corsair. That was their favorite tactic. Pull tight, spin fast, make the enemy overshoot. But now, it wasn't working. The Corsair's pilots had adapted. They didn't dogfight the old way. They used speed, hit hard, and climbed fast. They fought on their terms. Captain Ryoichi Yamamoto, a veteran Zero pilot, wrote in his journal, "We used to be the hunters. Now it feels like we are the hunted." These American planes, especially the big one with the crooked wings, strike like a hawk, then vanish into the clouds. Encounters became brutal. In one mission over the Bonin Islands, a group of Zeros tried to intercept American bombers, but a swarm of Corsairs dropped from high altitude before they could get close. The battle lasted minutes. Most of the Zeros were gone before they even fired a shot. Pilots called these surprise attacks boom and zoom. Corsairs would dive in at full speed, fire a short burst, and shoot back up. They didn't stay to dance. They struck and disappeared. And when they did choose to turn and fight, their powerful engines gave them the edge. The Japanese high command took notice. Orders went out to avoid direct combat with Corsairs unless absolutely necessary. It wasn't just fear, it was survival. Veteran pilots were vanishing. There were fewer each month, and the new ones coming in had barely flown in formation, let alone faced a skilled enemy in combat. Corsair squadrons, meanwhile, were only growing stronger. They trained constantly. Pilots studied enemy patterns. Their squadrons, meanwhile, were only growing stronger. They trained constantly. Pilots studied enemy patterns. They learned how to spot weaknesses, how to bait Zeros into mistakes. Their radios allowed fast teamwork. One Corsair in trouble could call for help and know someone would appear within seconds. The skies were becoming a chessboard, and the Corsair was a queen. Back in Tokyo, the mood was shifting too. Propaganda still claimed victory, but the numbers told the truth. Each battle cost more planes, more pilots, and more ground. Japan's air strength was fading, one flight at a time. American pilots noticed it too. When they returned from missions, they didn't talk about close fights anymore. They talked about how empty the sky had become. But they knew the enemy was still there, hiding, waiting, and sometimes desperate men are the most dangerous. The Corsair had earned its place, not just as a weapon, but as a symbol. When it appeared above the islands or the fleet, everyone, friend and foe, what it meant. The war was turning. The Corsair was leading the charge, and the men who once laughed at it now flew with heavy hearts, knowing what was coming. By 1943, the Corsair had already become a feared name across the Pacific. But what gave it its legend was not just its design or speed. It was the men who flew it, and no group made it more famous than the squadron that called themselves the Black Sheep. Their leader was Major Gregory "Pappy" Boyington. He was loud, bold, and fearless. Some thought he was reckless. Others thought he was crazy, but everyone agreed on one thing: he could fly. Boyington had already fought in China before joining the Marines. He knew the Japanese way of fighting. He knew how they thought in the air. When he got his hands on the Corsair, he pushed it harder than anyone. He taught his men to trust the plane's power. Use your speed, he told them. Climb high, strike fast, and never turn with a zero. The Black Sheep Squadron was made up of young pilots, some barely trained, some rejected from other units. Boyington turned them into hunters. They fought from the Solomon Islands to Rabaul, flying missions almost every day. They became famous for their wild energy and daring style. Their Corsairs roared through the clouds in packs of 4 or 6. They attacked Japanese airfields, bombers, and patrols. Every mission brought new stories. Pilots came back with holes in their wings and smoke trailing from their engines, but they came back alive. They counted their victories with small white marks painted under the cockpit. Boyington himself became a legend. In just a few months, he shot down dozens of enemy planes. Some say 28. Some say more. The Japanese even put a price on his head. When they heard the name Pappy, pilots on their side were told to be careful. They knew what it meant. The Black Sheep weren't perfect. They argued. They broke rules. They played hard after missions. But when the engine started and the wheels left the ground, they were unstoppable. Their Corsairs became part of them. The sound of those roaring engines meant safety, pride, and power. In one mission near Rabaul, the Black Sheep faced a large formation of Japanese aircraft. Outnumbered, they dove straight into the fight. The Zeros scattered. Within minutes, the sky was filled with twisting trails of smoke. When the fight ended, the Black Sheep had destroyed nearly all of them and returned home with just a few damaged planes. That day, word spread fast. The Corsair wasn't just a plane anymore, it was a symbol of American air power, and the Black Sheep became the face of it. Their courage gave the Corsair a soul. Their victories gave it a legend. And for every Japanese pilot who looked up and saw those bent wings shining in the sun, it meant one thing: the hunters were back, and the sky no longer belonged to them. As the war pushed toward Japan's doorstep in 1944, the sky battles began to change. Japanese pilots were running out of options. Their best aces were gone, and their newest recruits had barely learned how to land, let alone fight. The Zero was no longer feared. It was hunted. The Corsair now ruled the sky. With each island taken, the U.S. crept closer, and Japan grew more desperate. That desperation birthed a terrifying new tactic: the Kamikaze. These weren't just missions. They were one-way flights. Young men, barely out of school, were told to strap themselves into planes loaded with explosives and crash them into American ships. It was honor. They were told. It was duty. But deep down, it was hopelessness. The Corsairs saw this change first. Pilots noticed the enemy no longer turned to fight. Instead, they aimed straight at the ships below. There was no retreat, no escape, just a flash of light and a burst of fire. Captain Harold Swede Larson remembered it clearly. He wrote in his logbook, "We intercepted 2 Zeros. They didn't fire a shot, just pushed their noses down and dove. I couldn't believe it. They weren't trying to live anymore." The Corsairs became guardians of the fleet. They flew in tight circles above the carriers, eyes sharp, fingers ready. They weren't just looking for dogfights. They were trying to stop flying bombs before they hit steel and fire. It was a different kind of fight. More pressure, more fear. Because one mistake didn't cost a plane, it could sink a ship. On one harrowing day during the Battle of Okinawa, kamikazes poured in. Waves of them, Corsairs scrambled to intercept. Swarms of propellers cut the air. Tracers lit up the sky. Pilots shouted in radios, trying to cover every angle. Some kamikazes slipped through. Some didn't. One Corsair pilot, John Rogers, dove so steeply to stop a kamikaze that his engine nearly tore from the frame. He got the kill but barely pulled out of the dive. That night, on the deck of the USS Bunker Hill, pilots didn't celebrate. They sat in silence, helmets at their feet. They had saved the ship, but not all the ships were so lucky. The war had changed. This wasn't about honor in the air anymore. It was about stopping fire before it reached home. And still, the Corsairs rose to the task. They weren't made for mercy. They were made for survival. To guard the fleet, to protect the men below, and to stop anyone, no matter how determined, from turning the sea into a graveyard. The Corsair had become more than a weapon. It was a shield. And in those last brutal months, that shield was all that stood between thousands of sailors and the storm that tried to swallow them. When the war finally ended in 1945, many fighter planes were packed away, scrapped, or forgotten. But not the Corsair. Its story didn't end with a final dogfight. It became something more: a symbol of strength, speed, and survival. Pilots who flew it never forgot it. They called it the bent-wing bird with pride. It had saved their lives, won their battles, and carried them through some of the fiercest skies ever seen. Its howl in the dive, its roar on takeoffs, those sounds lived in their memories like a song of war and homecoming. In the Pacific, the Corsair changed how battles were fought. It could fly faster, climb higher, and dive steeper than almost anything the enemy had. It wasn't just a match for the Zero. It was its replacement. It forced Japan to change tactics. It gave the Allies air dominance, and it proved that daring design could win wars. But its story didn't stay in the past. The Corsair kept flying long after the last surrender. It served in the Korean War, still fast, still deadly, still dependable. In some countries, it flew even into the 1960s. That's how good it was. That's how trusted it became. Museums now hang the Corsair with pride. Veterans bring their grandchildren to see it. Their voices soften when they speak of it. That one, they say, pointing up. That's the one that got me home. Filmmakers used it to tell stories of heroism. Kids built models of it, dreaming of the sky. Artists painted it with sunlight on its wings and fire on its tail. And in those paintings, it was never still, always climbing, always chasing, always alive. Historians wrote about its battles, its pilots, its strange shape. But what they couldn't always capture was how it felt. To grip the controls, to feel the engine shake your bones, to hear the wind howl past the canopy at full throttle, to know deep down that you were flying a machine built to survive anything. The Corsair became more than an aircraft. It was a legend. It stood for courage in a time of chaos, for design that broke the rules, and for pilots who dared to fight with all they had. And so, the Corsair remains. Not just in photos or museums, but in the hearts of those who dream of the sky, who love the roar of engines, and who remember a time when the world was at war, and one strange-looking plane helped change its course. The Japanese pilots once laughed when they first saw it, but the Corsair had the last laugh written in smoke trails across the Pacific sky.